Welcome to Silicon Valley Innovation Center, where we promote discussion on technology and innovation through our executive immersion programs and our online events. We're coming live to you today through Facebook Live, through YouTube. So don't forget that in the comments section there, you can send us your thoughts, any questions for our guest today. My name is Rahim Rahimtullah. I'm a brand ambassador here at SVIC. Today, I'm going to be talking to Mathieu Guerville. He is Principal and Innovation Director at UL Ventures, and he joins us now. Mathieu, is the connection good there? Can you hear us?
All good, thanks, Rahim.
Perfect. I wanted to ask you, Mathieu, about UL Ventures, which you headed up when it began in 2017. That is relatively young part of the UL business, which has itself been going now for over a century, in fact. So I was hoping you could tell us a little bit about why UL decided to start a corporate venture capital fund, and why was it at that moment in 2017 that it was the right time to do that?
Sure. Well, I think it all follows part of a long journey. UL has been somewhat stuck in its own way and focusing on a very narrow definition of safety and a very narrow mission for the longest time, over 100 years. But over the past 10 years or so, we really started realizing that the definition of safety is evolving. People aren't so worried about their dishwasher or their toaster setting the house on fire or getting electrocuted by power tools, but they start worrying about other things, be it cybersecurity, maybe the quality of the plastics that are in their water bottles and such. So over the past 10 years, we've really had a very long journey towards more innovation to redefine what safety means and also redefine how we assess safety. So that has translated into roughly 70 acquisitions that actually used to be part of my role, a lot of internal programs as well. And I think about a year or two ago, myself and a handful of others started realizing that we had reached such a level of maturity in terms of innovation that some of the more forward-looking or exotic tools for more innovation could be potentially leveraged at that point. Corporate venture capital is obviously one of them. You may not be ready to do it when you just start doing innovation, but we felt that it was the right time for UL. So the idea, and why not only the right time in terms of maturity, but why does it serve our purpose, is we really think that a lot of technologies that UL has traditionally been involved in testing, certifying, and inspecting are moving at such a pace that we can't quite keep up. And frankly, if we went the traditional route of having our engineers keep up with what's happening, or sometimes acquiring companies, we would be a few years behind. And so who is not a few years behind, but instead a few years forward, that would tend to be startups. And so we want to be plugged in. We had been actually involved with startups before. We've done some collaboration projects, etc. But this was just a natural extension of doing it, cranking the dial up a little bit.
Sure. What do you look for in a startup to invest in?
Yeah, so I think there's mostly three things. Number one is obviously there needs to be a connection to safety in some way, shape, or form, either in the present form of the startup or in its not too distant future, because obviously we're still a mission-driven company. The second thing I think that we look for is actually some sort of correlation or ability to have an impact on UL's business within 3 to 5 years. And when I mean have an impact, it could be something that helps us do our job better. It could be simply technologies that we would leverage down the line. It could be an impact in a way of opening up new markets down the line, maybe collaborating with a startup, being a go-to-market channel or something, but essentially deliver the ability to bring new services to our customers, still in the spirit of the loosely defined concept of safety. And then we're obviously looking for the same thing that most investors, financial, strategic, are looking for. We're looking for quality in the people, quality in the project, and obviously things that are going to be relevant to us strategically. So if you have the new Instagram or a dog walking app, we wish you all the best, but it's not necessarily something that's going to resonate with our audience, both internally or even our customers. So we have to have some focus.
That makes sense, of course. And as you say, there are many advantages that investing in startups can bring to UL, but how do you approach the risks? And when I say risks, I mean, of course, there are the financial risks, as there would be with any venture capital investment, but I'm thinking more about the strategic risks in terms of potential clashes of culture between the UL corporation, between startups? How do you get the balance right between neither side having undue influence on the other?
Yeah, it's a great question, and it's one that we get all the time. Even internally, people are asking us, how are you going to make sure startups are also concerned, obviously, about protecting their IP and also not being too distracted by the big machine that a large corporation can be. So I will say nobody that I know has really solved it. I was recently at a conference on that very topic in Santiago, Chile, and no one really had a perfect answer. But there's a couple things that we do in terms of mitigating those risks. Number one is in terms of the segregation of duty between what we do and what we expose inside of UL and the information that the startups may communicate to us. We're also pretty liberal about letting startups limit our information rights. We essentially put some governance and some safeguards that way in this sort of the formal way. And then in the informal way, it's really about us, the ventures team, which is 5 strong, and we're actually hiring right now as well. We really play that role of hand-holding on both sides, and hand-holding can be facilitating, but sometimes it's also making sure that the proper governance again and the proper risk mitigation things are put in place. So that involves things such as prepping our internal UL teams before we introduce them to one of the startups, or giving the proper guidance in terms of the types of commercial agreements that they could develop. What are the things that would be fair? What are the things that would be unfair? And so essentially we play that role of facilitating the relationship, not only for it to create opportunities, but also so that it doesn't bring unnecessary risks.
And I'm wondering what you think. I mean, you say there are these risks, and of course you say you have structures in place to try to minimize those. And I think what we see is that corporate venture capital is actually a growing phenomenon. There are more and more companies launching funds to interact with startups in this way, in spite of those risks. And so I'm just wondering if, perhaps stepping back a little bit from UL, do you think that corporate venture capital is the right answer for any business seeking more innovation?
I think it's just a tool. And so if you only do corporate venture capital and nothing else with regard to innovation, if you don't have a proper culture, it's most likely going to fail, or maybe you will be successful from a passive investment perspective and you'll get attractive financial returns if you do it well. But you're not going to get what you're actually getting out of it. You're not going to get the innovation aspect of it. That being said, if you have the ability to do it, startups have limited amounts of time. They typically, in this day and age, don't have too much trouble raising money, especially the good ones. So their most valuable resource is really their talent, which is often pretty rare, especially if you look at things like machine learning or AI. And then just the sheer amount of time that they have in the day for their executives. And so you can get most of the benefits of corporate venture capital with just doing partnerships, commercial agreements, and other sorts of engagement with startups. But in reality, corporate venture capital allows you to have skin in the game. It allows you to show a real commitment to getting something done. I think many people who have been at big companies know that partnership discussions typically are things that start on one day, and then 18 months later with nothing actually accomplished, and it's just a bunch of lawyers sending documents and redlining, etc. When you do corporate venture capital, first of all, that can happen. There are other investors, financial investors that have a much higher pace, and so you have to keep up with them. You have to meet the same expectations. You have other people that are drafting terms in some cases if you're not meeting the investment, and so you have to abide by those terms. And that actually, in some ways, that constraint creates more speed than if you had free roaming and total control over a white sheet of paper to create terms of collaboration. So I think it's sort of a mechanism that puts more skin in the game, multiplies the return actually, because then, if you do a partnership and things go well, well, maybe you help yourself a little bit, you help the startup, but you don't really have the financial upside. If the startup really goes, really, really high and starts flying really high. So it's a good mechanism. It's not for everybody. You have to be mature enough in your overall innovation process. And it does bring about some risk, as we just talked about. But overall, I do think it's a good tool. And though many companies have started recently, I could foresee many more joining the trend.
And I wanted to ask about other possible routes to innovation. Like you say, corporate venture capital does carry risks. It may not be for everyone. And so if you do find yourself in one of those organizations, companies where corporate venture capital isn't an option, I wanted to ask what you think about other routes to achieving innovation. And I noticed, for example, on your Twitter feed that you had shared an article recently about how companies could invest or should invest in updating the skills of their employees, and could also prove useful in terms of innovation, because that can turn employees into futurists, to use the terminology of the article, and can keep them looking forward and ready to embrace change. And so that made me think, well, what if that could be applied then instead of something like corporate venture capital? Because not every business can start a venture fund, but every business can build its own culture.
Right.
So is that something maybe for a smaller business to look at if corporate venture capital is not an option?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think innovation needs two things to actually happen. One is a soft set of parameters, and that's the culture. That's really feeling that ideation, innovation, that failure is okay. It's all sort of untangible, how to quantify things, but that need to foster the right environment. That starts with attracting the right type of talent, retaining it, and fostering their creative aspect. So that's one side of it. And absolutely needs to happen. And that article about continuous learning is part of that. And then the other thing, you need some processes, because if you have a bunch of very creative people with a lot of great ideas roaming around the office, but there are no processes, no pathways for them to actually start executing on the ideas, then nothing will happen. And so you need to have those two things, and they need to be somewhat at the same level. You can have things such as very simple, an idea box, where people know that if I have an idea, I know where to send it, because you may have an idea that's not relevant to you. I mean, we have engineers that may be working on electrical appliances, but just because of the side interest or maybe what they studied in school, they have an idea that could help us in material science. Their chain of command, the org chart, does not have really a good pathway for that. But if the company has an idea box that is publicly available, well promoted, and where people feel like things will happen, that could be one thing, very simple. Then you have other things that many companies are doing, such as hackathons. We've done a lot of executive leadership training at UL that includes a very heavy component on entrepreneurship, and, teaching things like lean startup and all of that, having startup competitions for a select few people every year that go through a very intensive training. So it's a set of, again, culture, the very soft aspect, and then processes that actually start making execution possible.
It sounds like what you're saying there is what maybe we could call entrepreneurship within a company, and that seems like a powerful concept.
That's right. Although some of it, you could do things that use the concept of open innovation, and not everything has to come from inside. You could do a hackathon that takes ideas from outside, whether it's academia or startups, etc. But likewise, if you do that in isolation and you don't have the internal culture to adopt the results, what you're going to do is you're going to have a really cool event, a very large bill for pizza delivery, and then you will have basically nothing to show for it, because all of the outcome, nobody will have the time to do anything with it. Nobody will have even the mindset to do anything with it. I think people look for little gimmicks and silver bullets. One of the very famous one is obviously Google with the 20% rule. Employees can spend 20% of their time, or should spend 20% of their time on side projects. That's great, but in isolation, it does nothing. You could not take a random company out there and just tell people to start doing that if you don't have the appropriate culture and the pathway to then turn those little side projects into something a little bit bigger, and the mechanism to curate them, know which ones are worth investing more time in, which one should just receive a pat on the back and say, great, we learned something, but this is not really going to go anywhere, so let's focus on something else.
And the way you describe it, it does sound it is quite a complex process to make innovation work. And in that connection, I have read that innovation has been described as a field with a high failure rate. And I wonder if you would agree with that, because it sounds like from what you're describing, there are many areas, pitfalls, places where it can go wrong.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think innovation, as I mentioned earlier, you get the ideation process, and that as people will fail 100 times in their head before they even say something publicly. You'll come up with 100 ideas and then realize this wouldn't really work. And so you get that level that most people don't even realize is failure, and that's okay. It's good failure. But then where most innovation really failed is actually on the execution. It's that one idea that you have the courage to speak forth and to say, we should try X, Y, or Z. The reality is most of them will fail, and that's okay, but they have to fail. And I hate to use tired cliches, but they have to fail fast, and you have to learn from it. And I think, one of the reasons why innovation is very hard is people are still afraid of failure for good reason. In many companies, in many cultures, failure will get you somewhat blacklisted for promotions. It will essentially have a negative impact. And so then what you have happen is people that may be innovative, but can be still somewhat risk averse. So maybe they have a family to feed and they don't feel like sacrificing their career by exposing themselves to unnecessary risk that's not actually in their job description. And so all of those things are very hard to manage. And it's not something that can happen overnight. It's not something that's going to be just purely by setting a new employee handbook and a bunch of processes. It really does come down to, does the culture allow it? And then do the processes enable it?
And does that come down helping people to get over this fear of failure and this risk aversion? Does that come from, say, the top of a company, setting an example from the management downwards? Or how can you help people to get over that?
Yeah, I do think innovation can come from top or bottom, but the enablement and the structure and the tolerance for failure absolutely has to come from the top. I mean, the top is just by design where performance reviews happen, where promotion decisions happen, etc. And so if failure at that level is perceived as something that turns an employee into a black sheep, then everything, the foundations start eroding very quickly. So obviously, you're absolutely right. It needs to come from the top from that perspective.
And another essay I know you've talked about in the past has come from one of the partners at Y Combinator, who has said that, and perhaps it's sort of what we're doing today, is talking about innovation and looking at different ways of doing it, different philosophies, different pieces of advice about how it should be achieved. And in this Y Combinator essay, the author was actually talking about how this more applies to startups, where they maybe an entrepreneur might want to start a company, but is a little bit afraid to do that and is shopping around for advice. It's asking everyone what they think and what's the right way to do things before they actually take any steps. And I thought maybe in the innovation field, the same thing can happen, where everyone's sort of looking around trying to find out what's the best way to do something without actually doing it. So what's your take on that? Should companies just jump in, like you say, fail fast and just iterate through it? Or would they be best to, definitely take it slowly and make sure they get it right?
Yeah, I mean, I'm a big fan of this idea of playing in a sandbox. And when you're a startup and you have 2 employees, or not even employees, but a couple of founders together, your whole company is a sandbox. And so you can throw everything at the innovation wall and see what sticks. And as soon as something doesn't stick, then you pick it back up, reshape it a little bit and throw it at a different wall. In a big company, it's much harder to do that for the reasons that we discussed earlier. Maybe if too many people see you fail, that will have a negative impact. And also, frankly, the size of the wall and all of the implications of a failed product could be magnified to a very large extent and be really detrimental. But innovation doesn't have to always happen for everything. You could just try a new product for only a select few customers in a select few markets. You could even create a product and only test it internally. Or you could create a product, spin it off, or you could partner with a startup that has a product and kind of see how things work. You don't have to sort of go all in the deep end. And so I think it tends to be sort of an excuse. Innovation is one of the things that people are a little bit scared of. Even people who are innovators, they're a little bit scared of the consequences. Whether it's to lose face or again have negative impact in your career. People are always looking for excuses as to why it can be done. And I do think that if you just narrow the scope, you mitigate the damage, not by changing the idea. If you have a good idea, don't make it, if you have a really disruptive idea, don't make it merely incremental just to mitigate the risk. Keep it disruptive, keep it really interesting and exotic, but do it in a very small environment, really contained where, if something goes wrong, the virus doesn't spread and we don't turn the whole planet into a zombie apocalypse movie. Some examples, something I know recently, I talked with you guys, with people from Nigeria, and their excuse for why innovation was difficult, and I use excuse loosely, right, was there's a lot of corruption, etc. And so I challenged, I think he was the dean of the university, or maybe a professor for the entrepreneurship program, and I challenged him and said, but are you corrupt? Is your department within the university corrupt? No. Okay, well, why don't you try something in there, whether it's a digital currency or whether it's a small app or something. Why don't you try it first in your department, in that safe sandbox? And then if it works, then it might be worth trying to overcome the bigger hurdles. And that's sort of how it works. Another one was with a banking institution. Their excuse was obviously regulations and the risk, and we have so many customers and so much money. If this doesn't work, it's like, well, you can try it on 10 customers. What's the worst that could happen with 10 customers? You pick 10 that you could cover all the losses if needed, and try it like that. Not everything has to be straight to the deep end.
And thank you, Matthew. And I think that's sound advice. And I think we're just coming to the end of our time now, unfortunately, today. So if I could ask you just to, perhaps, we've been talking about how there's so much advice out there, and you've obviously given us plenty of really useful insights. But if I had to put you on the spot and just say, boil it down for me to one key thought or idea that you'd like the listeners and viewers, the executives out there, to take away with them when it comes to making innovation happen, what would that be?
Well, I'll go with something we haven't talked about today, but I'm a big believer that curiosity is where all of the ideas happen. And so you need to create either hire really curious people that will always be tinkering on the side or reading about things that are not related to their job. Or if you already have a staff you want to work with, start to foster that curiosity, expose people to different things, because the first step of innovation is ideation. And in reality, I do believe that you need curiosity and sort of that exploratory mindset to come up with ideas in the first place. Then execution, you can recruit people or consultants even to put all the right frameworks in place to give you the tools to manage and curate and all of that. There's plenty of that. But the mindset, people coming up with ideas that are actually worth betting on, that can be quite tough. So foster curiosity or hire it.
Perfect. Thank you, Matthew. Curiosity and the keynote for our talk today. Many thanks for joining us here at Silicon Valley Innovation Center.
Thank you.
And thank you to our listeners and viewers. Don't forget, the recording of our talk today with Matthew is going to be up on our website very shortly. That's siliconvalley.center. You can find it there. You can also find recordings of our past webinars and interviews, and you'll see a schedule of all the ones which are upcoming. I'd just like to remind you, we have one upcoming, which is going to be next week, August 7th, 9 a.m. Pacific. That's going to be with Gregory LeBlanc. He is a lecturer at the Haas School of Business. It's going to be extremely interesting, just like Mathieu has been for us today, but that's where we'll have to wrap it up. So many thanks for joining us, and we'll see you again soon. Bye-bye.